In this video, I'm going to cover 8 sketching tips that I use all of the time to help speed up my sketching productivity. So let's take a look. So the first tip I want to share is using the horizontal vertical constraint and the shift key to line things up and get them centered. So for example, I want this circle to be in the center of this rectangle. Now what some people will do is draw a line from one corner to the other, and then use the midpoint constraint, and then pick on this line, and sure enough, that puts the circle in the midpoint of that line. Well, there's an easier way. I'm going to pick on horizontal vertical, and you'll notice as I hover over this line, it just highlights it, but nothing's happening. But if I hold down my shift key and kind of move toward the center, you'll see a little X and that little midpoint icon. So what I'm going to do is click on this point here, come up to this line and hold down my shift key and click where we see that midpoint icon, and you'll see that it's lined up the center of the circle to the middle of this line. I'll do the same thing here. I'll click on that point, come over to this line holding down my shift key, and once again we can see that midpoint icon appear. I'll go ahead and click, and now the circle is lined up horizontally and vertically with the rectangle. And if I were to change the size of this rectangle, you can see that that circle stays in the center. And we didn't have to draw that extra line. Now I'll go ahead and do that again because you'll see it's actually pretty quick. So I just click a point, shift, click that point, shift, click, and we are now centered. I find that even faster than trying to come over to the line command, draw 2 points, and then do the midpoint command. So the second example is to use the equal constraint instead of multiple dimensions. So you can see here I have a larger rectangle with 2 smaller rectangles. And you might think, I want these 2 smaller rectangles to be the same size. So we'll go ahead and add a dimension of 1 and let's just say 0.75. And then you might do the same thing here where you'll type in 0.75 and 1. And now my sketch is fully constrained. But I've got a bunch of dimensions on here that are unnecessary. So I'm going to go ahead and undo. And I've created these 2 dimensions, and instead of creating dimensions for this rectangle, I'm going to use the equal constraint. What I can do is say I want this vertical line and that vertical line to be equal in length. And you can see how it became shorter. And I want that horizontal line and that horizontal line to be equal in length. And if I expand open my sketches, we can see that it's fully constrained. And what's nice about this is if I make a change to one of these, 1.5, both of those will change. We change this to be 0.875, both rectangles change. And it just simplifies your sketch. So use the equal constraint as much as you can to simplify your sketch. My third tip for Fusion sketches is clicking an existing dimension to reference it. So for example, I want to add a dimension here. I'll go ahead and place that dimension, and you'll notice it's asking for me to type something in. Well, I want this to be 4 inches. Well, I already have a dimension on here of 4 inches. So instead of typing in 4, I can go ahead and click on this existing dimension, and you'll notice it says D1. I'll just hit enter. And now we can see it says FX, which stands for formula of 4. So if we were to change this to be 3.5, that has to be 3.5. So it's almost like using the equal constraint, but it's using dimensions instead. The fourth tip for Fusion sketches is creating live parameter names when creating a dimension. So let's say, for example, I'm creating a plywood shelf. So I'm drawing a rectangle, and I'm going to hit the tab key to specify the length. and it's asking for a dimension. Well, I can actually type in length is equal to 24. Let me zoom out just a little bit, and you can see that it says length equals 24. I'll go ahead and hit tab to go to this other cell, and I could say thickness is equal to 0.75. And we now have created some parameters. If I go into modify, change parameters, you'll notice we have a length parameter and a thickness parameter that were created automatically. Now I could have come up here and created a parameter this way. For example, depth is equal to, let's just say 12. But instead of having to do it in the parameter table, I was able to do it right when I was creating my rectangle. I can also do it when I'm creating my dimensions. So let's say, for example, actually, I'll go ahead and leave that. Let's say I want to create a dado. So I'm going to draw a rectangle here, like so. Now I'm going to add a dimension. I'll place that dimension and I'll just say dado width is equal to thickness. I'll say enter, and there we go. I can say this distance here is whatever thickness is divided by 2. So it's going to be half the thickness of the material. And then I can place a dimension on how far from the edge I want that to be to fully constrain this sketch. I could say I want this to be collinear with this top edge. And I now have my dado that is controlled by these parameters. The fifth tip is typing in different units when entering a dimension. So you'll notice I'm currently in inches for my units. So if I were to create a dimension here, you'll notice that it's 5 inches. Well, I'll go ahead and create a dimension here, and I could say I want this to be 45 mm for millimeters. So I'm going to type in 45 millimeters, and it's going to convert that for me automatically. I can even do, I'll go ahead and undo that. I can even do things like, I want that to be 2in plus 5 mm. So 2 inches plus 5 millimeters. I'll hit enter, and you can see it's going to figure out what that needs to be. And if I were to edit this dimension, it actually remembers that value for me. So I could come back and say, I want that to be 2 inches plus 15 millimeters. And it's, again, going to figure that out. This is really good for if you have, I'll go ahead and set this to be like just 3 inches. So you have inches for this, but let's say the circles that you're creating for like the drill throughs are metric. So instead of switching my units, I could just come in here and say, make this a 5 millimeter hole, hit enter, and it did the conversion for me. The next tip is creating a radius dimension circle instead of a diameter dimension circle. So if you go to create circle, you'll notice it says center diameter circle, and we don't see a radius circle. So if I were to place my circle and start to drag, we can see the arrow goes all the way across the circle, which is a diameter. Now, if I right mouse click, you'll notice there is not an option for radius. So what you basically need to do is just randomly click your circle, then use the dimension tool, click on your circle, and again, you'll notice it's creating a diameter dimension. But now if I right mouse click, I get the option to specify I want this to be a radius instead of a diameter. So I'm going to say radius, and now you can see that the line doesn't go all the way across. It's going from the center to the outside of the circle. And I can say I want that to be 0.5, and we now have a 0.5 radius circle. The next tip I want to talk about is using the trim command under the modify menu. Now, if I click on trim and hover over a segment, you'll notice that this little segment turns red. So if I were to click here, it's going to delete to the next boundary, which is this line right here. So if I were to click here, it's going to delete to the next boundary. So that would take quite some time to trim all of the geometry to make this like a valid hollow profile. Well, here's a neat little trick. So I'm going to click on trim, and then if I click and hold, you can basically paint. You'll notice my cursor has this little square on it. It's kind of like basically like a little paintbrush, and I'm holding down my cursor. So I'm just basically dragging over the geometry that I want to get rid of. And you can see how quickly I was able to turn this into an exterior profile that I could then, for example, come in here and offset to something like that, for example. So my last Fusion Sketches tip is to expand open your Sketches folder to see if your sketch is fully constrained. Now you'll see a pencil icon, which means you need to continue editing this sketch to fully constrain it. We want to see a lock symbol. So whenever I'm in my sketches, I always expand open my sketches folder so I can visually see. Now, one of the other ways to visually see is if the lines turn black, it means they're fully constrained. And if they're blue, it means that they're not fully constrained. So I'm going to go ahead and add in some dimensions here really quick just to constrain this sketch. And I can still see that it's not fully constrained, so I need to continue adding some dimensions here. Let's make that 1.5. And now I can see the lock symbol says that this sketch is fully constrained. Now, you might think, oh, how come I didn't add a dimension here? Well, we have the total length here, and we have this length here, so Fusion knows what that length needs to be. In fact, if I were to try and place that dimension, it would tell me I'm over constraining my sketch. So again, this is a very visual way to see, is your sketch fully constrained? I hope you learned something new and enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure you've hit like and subscribe. That way you'll be notified of upcoming videos. If you'd like to learn more about Fusion, make sure you visit my webpage at cadedllc.com. And as always, have fun learning Fusion.